Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor but enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, joined by Lucy Crehan, author of the fantastic Cleverlands and international education consultant. Hi, Lucy. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's been a long time coming. I think Cleverlands might be one of the first edu books that I sort of really engaged with on my own terms, and I think it was a game changer really in terms of the angle you were coming from. I mean, it must seem a long time ago now.
Yeah, it does. I'm really, really pleased to hear that though. And I've had a few people say it was their first edu book, and that fills me with joy because it was very much intended to be not written for only for people who are already into that kind of thing, but for any teachers or parents that were interested in what was going on elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, because I mean, my sort of memory of it is that it was part story, part this is what we can learn from other jurisdictions and things like that.
Mm.
You know, that really struck a chord, and since then we've been blessed, I think, with lots of books that try to draw the sort of toe that line between the engaging but also the really
Hmm.
informative. Most recently, you've been working with the government in the north of Ireland, sort of reviewing the curriculum. And I thought, you know, I very rarely do episodes that are dedicated solely to sort of, I don't know what the term is, the land of my upbringing.
Land of my fathers.
Yeah, I mean that would be Welsh, wouldn't
Yes.
it? So I thought it'd be really good to talk about your experience and to sort of see
Mhm.
what lies in store, because it feels like there's a big shift taking place, and it's really good
Mm.
to see. So I mean, in your experience, what makes the education system in the north of Ireland distinctive when compared with those you've studied internationally?
Mm. I suppose, like any education system, it's a combination of features, and while no individual feature itself is unique, it's the combination of those features that makes it that unique and unlike any other education system. So I suppose kind of key things that stand out for me about Northern Ireland, especially when you're comparing it um, to England, Wales, and Scotland, would be a combination of a select number of high quality teacher education institutions, meaning that teaching is still a quite high status profession. It's highly respected, and quite competitive to get in. Um, and that in combination with a selective school system. So it's a grammar school system. There's a test at the end of primary school. I appreciate you know all this, Kieran, but just for your listeners who aren't familiar with the context in Northern Ireland. And then particularly interesting in combination with that selective system, then you also have a a Northern Ireland curriculum which actually has more in common with curricula in Wales and Scotland, in terms of it being quite a high level curriculum, outlining some broad learning outcomes rather than any kind of specific detail of what children should learn in different subjects, and with a focus on skills and personal capabilities. So the combination, of course, there are many other features as well, but even if you just take those three, I'm not aware of any of the countries that have those three things in combination. Um, in terms of the countries that I've studied. So it's a really interesting place to go, and especially given that I was going in to look at curriculum, interesting to compare that to other curricula within the UK, taking into account the very different places um, in which those curricula are implemented.
And that's really interesting because you know when we you see the discourse about the different curricula within the United Kingdom, you've got you know, Scotland and Wales are often held up against England in terms of, you know, they're almost in direct contrast to each other.
Mm.
Would you consider the Northern Irish curriculum to be sort of somewhere in between, or is it very much a case of it's on that curriculum for excellence and curriculum for Wales sort of end of the sort of
So I would say
continuum?
yes, it is more on the end of the Welsh and the Scottish curricular approaches. But in terms of the system, I would say it's somewhere in the middle. But in terms of the curriculum, I'd say it is more similar to Wales and Scotland than to England in terms of its structure, in terms of its the level of specificity versus generality, and that focus on the skills. Yeah, many commonalities with curriculum for excellence and curriculum for Wales.
And are they reviewing the curriculum just because it's been a reasonable amount of time since the last review, or is it in response to anything, or perhaps you're not even allowed to sort of suggest why?
I mean, I think it is partly because it's been a long time. So the current curriculum was introduced in 2007. So that's a long time by international standards, for any curriculum to run without being reviewed. And of course, the world has changed, and Northern Ireland has changed since then. And so it was time for a curriculum refresh, I suppose, in that respect. Another reason that was brought up by the minister in terms of announcing the curriculum review was comparing PISA trends in Northern Ireland with the rest of the UK, where in his words, it had stagnated over time, or had stayed the same, hadn't improved. Whereas England, and actually outside of the UK, the Republic of Ireland had both seen improvements over the past decade or so, and Northern Ireland wasn't keeping up. So that was another reason given for reviewing the curriculum.
Yeah, I mean that is interesting because I remember I always felt like we were punching above our weight when it came to international things. But suppose you've only got 1.5 million people in total, and how many of those are going to be children? So perhaps that's my interpretation wasn't reasonable. But reading seemed to be something that was fine. The quality of teaching and reading seemed to be on your literacy levels and stuff. Um, but clearly that seems to be, like you said, changing over time.
Yeah, and what's really interesting in terms of interpreting assessment um, within the UK is you have GCSEs in both in Northern Ireland and in England, but they're different exams. They're different exams, there's different organisations that are marking them and deciding on grade boundaries. And Northern Ireland always comes out doing very well in those GCSEs if you are to compare the two. But in my review, I called into question whether we really can compare the two, because they are so different, and especially because since various GCSE changes in England a few years ago, in terms of like moving away from modular examinations, for example, were not followed. Not that they should be, but those changes didn't happen in Northern Ireland. They're very different approaches to assessment. Um, and interestingly, you kind of see an opposite trend in GCSE results versus PISA results. And again, those are different assessments. They are kind of measuring slightly different things, but it does somewhat, when you look at the bigger picture, both the GCSEs and those international test results, does somehow kind of muddy the waters a little bit in terms of that narrative of, oh, everything's absolutely fine and we outperform the rest of the UK. So, not cause for concern, but cause for consideration, I would say.
Given your extensive experience of international curricula and the systems that house them, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Northern Ireland curriculum?
So before I actually answer that in terms of the strengths and weaknesses, I want to frame it slightly differently in the sense that when I went in to do this review, to review the curriculum, I didn't initially go in comparing the Northern Ireland curriculum with international systems and judge its strengths and weaknesses based on that. And I was actually quite deliberate in not doing that in the first instance, because it was really important to review the curriculum in Northern Ireland on its own merits. And so that the first half of my review, I wasn't kind of drawing on that international evidence at all. I was running focus groups, speaking with lots of different stakeholders, obviously lots of teachers and school leaders in particular. And we had a teacher questionnaire as well that we put out to teachers, and an open call for submissions. So that was kind of all the evidence that I was drawing on in the first instance to establish what the strengths and weaknesses were. And I then pulled out from that, right, what are the key strengths of the system? What are the key weaknesses of the system? And only at that point did I then start to kind of corroborate really with evidence from other education systems on what has worked or not worked in terms of similar design features, and then use that to suggest what the changes might be to try and solve those problems while retaining the strengths. So that's a very long preamble, but I think it's quite important that I didn't kind of go in there and immediately say, well, this is not a good curriculum because it's like this or like that. That instead, all the strengths and weaknesses that I reported in that review came from the ground, from the stakeholders in the system that use it. So all of that said, there was actually still some kind of triangulation there in terms of my international understanding of evidence elsewhere and what was going on in Northern Ireland. specifically that one of the main strengths of the curriculum that was reported by teachers was its flexibility. So I mentioned earlier, it's quite a broad, high-level curriculum in terms of it leaves quite a lot of open to interpretation around what students should be learning. And teachers appreciated that flexibility when it came to being able to introduce things that they thought the students might find particularly interesting, and also to pitch the learning at the right level, so based on what the students could understood already. So that was one of the key strengths. Several also reported that they appreciated the focus on skills, that it wasn't only about knowledge, it wasn't all rote learning, and there was this focus on skills as well, and they appreciated that. And also that there was an encouragement in the curriculum of making connections across subjects, and it wasn't conceptualized as subjects in silos that didn't relate to each other. So those were some of the key strengths, and I really have attempted in terms of the recommendations I set out and what we'll be doing, starting very soon, in fact, in terms of designing the new curriculum framework. I really sought to retain those strengths, obviously to make changes, but to try and do so in a way that retained those important features. The weaknesses, kind of the key weakness about the curriculum itself, was really the flip side of that flexibility. So, and some teachers and school leaders actually, would say the same thing say both things in the same breath. So they'd say, yeah, on the one hand, it's great to have this flexibility and we appreciate that. On the other hand, it's not specific enough. And that lack of specificity around what children should know leads to a variety of problems. So some of the teachers, parents, school leaders express that directly, and saying things like it's vague or it's woolly or it's not specific enough. Lots of the other problems that were put to me about the curriculum were results of that lack of specificity. There were kind of further down the line problems that came about as a result of the lack of specificity in the curriculum. So, for example, problems at transitions, particularly between primary and post-primary, as you call it in Northern Ireland, i.e. secondary, where there was so much variability in what students were learning in the primary phase that when they then came to the first year of secondary school, the teachers would say, well, we have to start from scratch in most subjects because there's no commonality in what they're learning. And what that means is that some students get bored, they get disengaged because they're having to study the same thing again. Second World War, for example, lots of repetition of that. And yet others, potentially there's gaps or things that teachers have to rush through because most of the class do know this, but actually these children don't. And that was quite stark, actually, even in terms of my conversations with students. I focused in on year 8, which is the first year of secondary school, and interviewed groups of students, and we're asking them about what they remembered about primary school, what they learned in primary school, what did you learn, what did you learn about science, what do you think, and even within the same class, you would have some students who would report a whole list of exciting things that they did in science or topics that they studied in science, and others would say, well, we didn't do science in primary, which of course won't have been true. They would have done some science, and you can't base everything on the testimony of a 12-year-old. But the fact that they didn't remember it, they clearly hadn't done very much, whereas others had done lots. So there's just a huge variability as well in terms of what was being learned. So there's a couple of the problems that resulted from the lack of specificity. Teacher workload is another. Lots of teachers talked about reinventing the wheel, and kind of wishing that if everyone was slightly more on the same page, they could be sharing resources a bit more. And then a slightly more technical one, and this is where I started to draw on international research, but also cognitive science, is the lack of coherence. And when you don't have a specific curriculum, it's quite difficult, or certainly hard to ensure that students' learning builds carefully, deliberately, and sequentially over time. And it can be a case of hopping from one topic to the other without students necessarily being able to either see the links or there necessarily being any links in there at all, depending on what that subject is.
Wow. So I mean, yeah, I mean the teachers. So because there's often this big conversation about the balance between autonomy and consistency and things. So
Mm.
when you spoke to the teachers, they were actually, it seems like they're enjoying lots of autonomy in terms of their classrooms and their curricula. but their reflections were that actually a little bit more specificity would be beneficial to them. Is that a fair
So certainly
interpretation?
some of them said that. I mean, I wouldn't dream of saying that all teachers thought one thing or the other, and I think probably some would want to keep it just how it is, and others would want to do the opposite and have it be much more specific. But definitely, lots of people did say to me, yeah, it's too vague, it's too willy. We just need to know what we're supposed to be teaching, really. Um, and that does not mean, there are lots of different degrees. This is not a black and white. It's either flexible or you're told what to do in every lesson. You can be more specific than the curriculum in Northern Ireland is, and the same applies to curriculum for excellence in Scotland and curriculum for Wales. Um, you can be more specific while still leaving lots of autonomy for teachers around the context through which they're teaching important ideas and important concepts.
Yeah, sorry, it's not my intention to paint you into a corner with
No, 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 not at
my
all.
really blunt questioning, but I just find that really interesting because yeah, my memory of teaching practice was that sort of the teacher was the teacher for maybe 30, 40 years, and once you had your class, you had your class for forever. And so I never thought workload would be interpreted would be the same. Oh, I don't know. Workload never seemed to be on teachers' minds whenever I trained in Northern Ireland. But
Mm,
so
that's interesting.
genuinely, my experience is it's being challenged, so to speak. But
Yeah, well, I suppose that. Well, when did you do your teacher training actually?
2004 to 2008.
Yeah, so that would be pre this curriculum. So the curriculum before this one in Northern Ireland was more specific. And so there would have been resources that could have been shared across schools at that point that schools could teach, the same curriculum each year, unless they wanted to
Right.
make it their own or teach it in a different way.
Okay, all right. Okay, so the world they're living in is a world I have no experience of
Yes,
at
it's a
all.
different
Awesome.
curriculum.
That's really interesting because I remember, yeah, because we had like math lessons would be based on I think it was in the schools I was in, we're using the Heinemann maths textbooks sort of series and stuff like that
Hmm.
there, and it felt a lot more like you say, consistent and specific, because I always think back to when you mentioned the sort of almost the two sides of this coin, Tim Oates talking about content rich curriculum. It doesn't matter what content it is, as long as it's rich in your curriculum is rich in content, that kind of thing. So it sounds
Mm.
like that could be really beneficial if that's the direction they choose to go.
Mm. I do think that the textbooks is it's such a complex area, isn't it? Anyway, but textbooks is like a mediating layer. So I don't know, give 2004 to 2008, I don't know whether your teacher education institution would have been basing that on the new curriculum or the old, but even if you have a fairly high level curriculum, as maths is more specific in Northern Ireland than some other subjects, but it's still much higher level than many, certainly than England. Um, if you're set on a particular textbook scheme, well, in a way, it doesn't really matter. As long as that textbook is scheme is a good one, and it's the same scheme from year 8 to the end of school. Well, it does then. I suppose, or sorry, for primary context from reception upwards, then it doesn't matter because the curriculum will be interpreted by that textbook designer so that it is specific and coherent. The issue is where schools pick a mix and feel like either because there's sometimes there's a culture around this, but they feel like they shouldn't be just using the same textbook and going all the way through it, that they have a little bit from here, a little bit from there, some worksheets from various different resourcing platforms. And that's where you end up lacking in coherence potentially.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Obviously, yeah, because
Mm.
also thinking about it was a long time ago, too long, really. I'm wondering, textbook use fell off a cliff in England in the 80s, didn't it? Maybe
Yeah.
something similar happening around, but there's absolutely no way to find out unless the kind of research that Cambridge Assessment were conducting
Mhm.
is replicated. It's beside the point. I'm just sort of trying to tie my experience into
Mm.
where things seem to be now, because I find it really really interesting because um, that's not an easy balance to strike, in terms of those strengths and sort of weaknesses.
Mhm.
It's I can see both the benefit and if you tip too far one way, you're almost in your PISA scores are going to go in the wrong direction, aren't you? Almost like a Finland kind of situation.
Yeah. So I do you think this kind of middle layer in a way, so what, textbooks, which I think Tim Oates would call it the mezzanine materials, like a mezzanine layer, but textbooks, but equally you can have nationally organized resources, schemes of work, etc., which are not part of the curriculum, which are not compulsory, but that are available for schools to use. So I think that's quite a nice way of bridging that gap, in the sense that I have recommended that there is a more specific mandatory content in the Northern Ireland curriculum, so that the core content is a bit more specific than it is, but to try and stop, that there is that tension there, isn't there? You don't, on the one hand, you don't want to leave teachers with, right, it's not specific enough to stop you from having a huge workload, so off you go and fill in all these gaps, and that's going to take you ages. On the other hand, you don't want to give them a fully resourced everything and say you have to do that and take away their autonomy. So providing, initially a more specific curriculum framework, but then that is supported by non-compulsory resources, different ways of interpreting that curriculum that teachers and schools can choose between, I think is quite a nice way of managing that. And then, of course, if schools want to, they can take that curriculum and make their own, interpret it in their own way through different contexts that are, maybe unique to their area, for example. But if a nationally produced resource, and when I say nationally produced, I mean by teachers, but organised nationally, and available nationally, if that is appropriate, then they can use that as well, so that it is content rich.
Yeah, and you're probably working at the scale where that's actually possible, to a greater degree than perhaps on other parts of the UK. Were there any responses to your fact finding / exploration that really surprised you?
So I feel like maybe this is well, two things. One was around, again, this problem linked to specificity, something that I hadn't ever considered before, but that was a feeling of the curriculum being overloaded. Partly that comes from new initiatives, something's wrong with society, and this happens everywhere. And often that's then, oh right, well now all schools have to teach about this thing. And that's one source of schools being overloaded. But it's interesting also that they also felt overloaded. Some teachers expressed this to me, um, that it was, well, because the curriculum's not specific and there's these kind of high level statements, that could mean all sorts of things. And sometimes the response to that was, well, we've got to be careful we're not missing anything out, so we'll do all of it. Because it's not clear what you should and shouldn't do, and especially in a context which is, perceived to be high stakes, in terms of having an inspectorate, and whether or not that's what the inspectorate intend. Some schools perceive that as being, gosh, well, we we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing, we're going to be judged on this. Then you're more likely, if it's not clear, to cover all your bases and do all the things because you're not quite sure what they're going to be looking for. So that was surprising. And then also, I suppose, and this is not at all scientific, so I'm going to say this in the spirit of, this is not a scientific observation, this is just an observation. But I did spend as much time as I could in schools, but of course, being one person and the whole thing being over the course of 5 months, that I wasn't able to visit anywhere near a representative sample. But I spent all the time that I was over in Northern Ireland, I did spend in classrooms whenever the school day was running, watching lessons basically. Um, and the teaching was more traditional than I would have expected, given the curriculum that they had. So the curriculum that they had, quite similar to many of the what are kind of termed new curricula, although it was early 2000s now, so they're not quite as new as they used to be. But including Curriculum for Excellence, Curriculum for Wales, is a move towards more learner-centered pedagogies, and that being expressed as the teacher taking a bit of a step back, and the students being a bit more self-directed. And given that that's what was kind of some of the language in the curriculum as well, I didn't see as much of that in schools as I expected to. Which isn't I'm not making a judgment on that, but it wasn't quite what I expected. And I suspect that's partly as a result of the transfer test, what we call in England the 11+ test. So there was, more traditional teaching.
Yeah, and I know that listeners will interpret your statement in the spirit in which it's intended. Because like I mean, that was my enduring memory of Singapore, where lots of the conversations on a higher level were about the child centered, fulfillment of the individual kind of situation. But actually, when it came down to it, it was very very high quality, effective instruction taking place in classrooms. Does that? I mean, again, offered in the same spirit. It's not scientific, but that was my memory when talking to lots of teachers and visiting as many schools as possible. So it almost feels like I'm probably being too presumptuous to say that that's quite common in terms of
Yeah.
the actual day to day is teachers know what works in their classrooms, but you
Yeah.
can still aim for those lofty ideals without them becoming your pedagogical approach. I don't know. Do you reckon that's a fair assessment of how things
That
play
definitely
out?
happens in a few places. It's the same in Finland. I don't know whether that would be the case in Finland now, whether because the curriculum's been in place for some time, whether it would have finally filtered through, in terms of that there's more student-centered pedagogies, but certainly, um, I've visited twice. The first time obviously for a month, when I was writing my book, and then I went back as a part of a group of policymakers. And both times, the kind of the talk, or certainly the second time, all the talks were about how this is all student centered and just providing the right environment and the teachers take a step back. But when then you actually went and visited schools and had a look at classrooms, that's not what it looked like, or at least that's not what the group I was with. It's not what our interpretation of what that meant looked like. But I do think there are differences, obviously, within countries, between schools, and also between teachers of different generations. So that would be the case certainly in somewhere like Estonia, where they've had quite a lot of Soviet trained teachers, and they're quite an older teacher population compared to most countries. So a lot of their teachers are trained during the Soviet era, and that would be very traditional instruction. Yeah, all of the kind of the narrative around teacher education in Estonia is much more about being more progressive, more student centered. And that's what younger teachers are doing more of. So that's interesting even in itself, and that even within one country, you'll have quite different teachers doing quite different things. So be interested to see how that goes in Estonia as those older teachers retire.
People have been sharing lots of different articles and papers that have been published sort of as a result of the work that you're undertaking, and certainly in my experience, it's not unusual for tribal politics to impede progress, and it's not quite often. I mean, I studied politics for 2 years at secondary school
Mm-hmm.
for A level, and we were supposed to go on a visit to the assembly as part of that, and it was closed the whole time I was studying. So that's how much of a halt it can grind to.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is there anything to suggest, or anything you've seen that suggests that this is going to have enough momentum to push beyond the usual barriers that policy faces in Belfast?
I very much hope so. I mean, I'm no expert on Northern Irish politics. But what I can say thus far, and of course it's very early days. The review is only published in June. We're just about to start on the design of a new curriculum framework. In a couple of weeks. Um, but the review was well received in Northern Ireland by educators and professionals within the education sector of quite different sides of the kind of the educational political spectrum. So people who you would kind of consider to be more traditional and people who you consider to be more progressive, um, came to me and said they thought this was a good direction to be taking the curriculum in, and I was so careful, that is what I was trying to do, to really hear what everyone was saying in terms of what was working and what wasn't working, and to try and find a way through that wasn't just kind of reverting to what it used to be like, or having a massive pendulum swing from one set of problems to a different set of problems. And the headline there was that the curriculum that I'm recommending that they introduce would be purpose led and knowledge rich. In terms of acknowledging that ultimately the purpose of the education system, and this I haven't changed it beyond some wording to make it more in line with I think what the original intentions were. But the purpose of this curriculum is not just for children to pass exams and to know stuff. The purpose of the curriculum is much bigger than that. It's about broader societal aims, and especially somewhere like Northern Ireland, those are fundamentally important. We have to be looking at that big picture. The knowledge rich part is the means, it's the means to get there. And I've been very careful as well to define what I do and don't mean by knowledge rich in that review as well, because sometimes people who don't like the idea can tar it with the brush, or it comes with all sorts of other things that are nothing to do with knowledge or curriculum sometimes. And then think, oh, knowledge rich must mean that children just sit in rows and learn facts, and that's not what it is at all. So and equally, I've wrote a fair bit about skills and about capabilities and the role of knowledge in supporting those skills and capabilities, and how there needs to be time within the curriculum to develop those capabilities as well as understanding the knowledge. So it was it's quite long, Kieran. But it was done in a way that was truly trying to find a way through this educationally political, sometimes hostile debate. So I think from an educational perspective within Northern Ireland so far, unless people hate it and aren't telling me, but I have, it's a small place, as you know, and I did make an effort to really get to know lots of people and to have my metaphorical door open to speak to anyone who wanted to speak to me. So that gives me hope, that if the education sector are behind this, if we can build momentum in terms of course, there'll be lots and lots of people who don't yet know about what we're doing. But if we can build that support from within the education sector, then I think the politicians of all parties ultimately want a high quality education system that is equitable. And that's what this curriculum review and my recommendations were intended to do. And that's what the curriculum design process that is about to begin will be aiming for. So if you can do those two things, if we can continue to make sure that both, quality and equity at the heart of this, and we can bring the education sector along with us and make that something that works for them, then I very much hope that political parties of all colours will support that as well.
It sounds fantastic. I mean, bridging the ideological divide in terms of education is it's no mean feat. And the fact that it seems to be everybody's pulling in the same direction, that definitely gives me hope. Like everything I've seen suggests that there's a real positive shift happening, and probably the most positive shift in my lifetime. So, fingers crossed. I'll be watching with is bated breath the right phrase? I don't know. Is that a positive thing to do?
Fingers crossed. If you cross your fingers.
Yeah, positive fingers. Because like you say, the only thing we love more than a false dichotomy in education is a straw man. It sounds like plenty of them against the knowledge-rich curricula. So that sounds fantastic. Looking ahead, what lessons from the approach they're planning to take in the north of Ireland do you think could be most valuable for their various neighbours in Britain? Probably namely Scotland and Wales, if I'm interpreting the situation correctly.
Well, I think England as well, to be honest. I think, I've spoken publicly previously about what I think Wales could learn from international evidence. And Scotland is quite similar. The curriculum for Wales was one of the key architects, or the key architect of curriculum for Wales was Professor Graham Donaldson, who's involved in the curriculum for excellence. So they're kind of siblings, if you like, in terms of curriculum. Although there are some key differences. But I do think, obviously there's a curriculum review ongoing in England at the moment too. And the what I've set out in terms of recommendations for the curriculum in Northern Ireland are a series of key features that the new curriculum framework should have. And some of those are more applicable to what I think needs to happen in Wales and Scotland. And Scotland are very much alive to these issues too. Education Scotland are doing quite a lot of work on curriculum. They've done some kind of what they haven't called them curriculum reviews, like it's a curriculum pilot, looking at what's going on in the schools, trying to understand what's going well, what's not going well in terms of curriculum for excellence. And they are making some changes to the technical framework. And specifically, they are planning to be more specific about knowledge, because they have recognised exactly some of the issues that were brought up in Northern Ireland, the same issues in Scotland around the difficulties across transitions, etc. So in terms of for Wales and Scotland, I think a bit more specificity, and coherence, and both like vertical coherence, by which I mean not just being specific, but thinking very carefully about the sequencing of that knowledge and related skills over time. And I think that is missing at the moment in both places, on account of just being too high level to kind of to guarantee that curricular coherence. In terms of England, is I think is a different challenge. I think the specificity is there for many subjects, not all subjects. There's definitely disparities even within the English curriculum, like science, very specific, music, not very specific. So you know that there are it's difficult to make any generalizations really. Um, but I think the kind of the key feature that England's curriculum is lacking is focus. By which I mean focus in a kind of the technical sense used by researchers Schmidt and Prawat when looking at key features of curricular and high performing education systems based on Tim's data. Coherence and focus were kind of two key things they found that were present in countries with high performing curricula, or sorry, high performing countries are present in their curricula that weren't in the lower performing curricula. And sorry, that was such a massive preamble. Like I've said that in a much more straightforward way. The focus basically means not too much stuff, to put it in slightly less technical language. So making sure that there's very deliberate decisions about what children should learn in any particular year, but making sure that there is not so much that there's not time for children to have a deep understanding of each thing. So it's related to the mastery approach in terms of that depth and making sure that all children are mastered it before you move on. But obviously that's not only a curriculum thing, that's also a pedagogy thing. But England does have quite a lot of content. And one analysis by Ben Jensen and colleagues in Australia, they did an analysis of the science curricula. I think it's about 7 different countries, and England had the most science content specified there, and you know significantly more than Hong Kong, more than Singapore, so more than countries that perform much higher than England in terms of PISA science. So I think the kind of the key lesson there would be England probably need to be a bit more selective about what's the most important stuff that we're going to make sure that all children learn. And obviously with the national curriculum, there's not a cap. It's not that if you include less stuff, then children aren't allowed to learn anything else. And if you have children or schools or classes who've already mastered this stuff already, then teachers have got that leeway to take them deeper or further or wherever you like. But there are problems with having an overly full curriculum, which can result in children who are already disadvantaged being further disadvantaged by the fact that they've not had that time to go over things in more depth, and they might not have the support at home to help them catch up.
Every second episode, we probably had a conversation about what we'd cut from the English national curriculum on the podcast. So it sounds like that focus is an absence of the clutter that we're currently experiencing in many areas. So yeah, because I can totally see that. Yeah, because I mean, obviously, I put a mathematics lens on everything because I spend so much time thinking about maths. But knowing the Singapore curriculum and the distinctions, you reach a much deeper level much sooner because you had, in my experience, you haven't had to wade through sort of not perhaps superfluous content. Like you say, and some children aren't getting to the end of that anyway, so to speak.
And I also think that all of these features are related, but if you have a more specific curriculum, you can actually put a bit more in it than if you have a more vague curriculum. Because I did a little unofficial comparison, just kind of eyeballing and measuring up the Northern Ireland curriculum with the Singapore curriculum for maths, just while I was doing this work. Not, it wasn't scientific enough to kind of put in the review and draw any conclusions in itself, but it wasn't that Singapore had less, even though Singapore is I'd say a fairly focused curriculum, but because it was quite clear about what children should learn in each year, it could then go on to the next thing quite clearly. Right, you've learned this thing, now you're going to learn this next thing, and now you're going to learn this next thing. Whereas the Northern Ireland version was quite vague about what it was that actually children should learn. So then in the next phase, it was a similar thing, not, but probably most teachers would go back to the beginning and start from the beginning because it wasn't quite clear what should have been before, or to what it, how far do we go and to what extent should they be able to do this thing or that thing. And then again, the next level up again would be, well, it's the same kind of thing, but the boundaries were not clear. So at no point could you be sure that children had learned something or even been taught something previously. Obviously, you can never be sure that children have learned something or will remember it. But in Singapore, you can be clear that children will have been taught something, and you can then check that understanding. Whereas based on the Northern Ireland curriculum, you cannot be sure what they would have done before.
Yeah, and it's our least experienced teachers who benefit least from that kind of system, isn't it?
Hmm.
Because, like I say, an experienced teacher might go, "Oh, I know roughly where they'll have picked up," and they'll be able to transition through that more quickly. So I can
Yeah,
imagine.
and that's a fascinating and I think an underexplored idea as well. It's something I noted. I had a conversation and wanted to had a look at some schools in Scotland. Was talking to them about curriculum, and one head teacher was saying, she had this new teacher, in a first or second year, saying, well, how are you supposed to know, based on this? They're called experiences and outcomes in Scotland. These fairly high level curriculum states, but how are you supposed to know what to teach within that? Like, how do you teach that? What's the thing you teach? And the other teachers all knew, oh, well, yeah, well, we do the seasons. And that's what, but how do you know that? Oh, we just know that because that's what we used to do in the old curriculum, and we just there's this kind of implicit knowledge from having been a teacher for a long time where you have a general sense of teach students of this age should roughly be about this level in this thing, but that's not written down anywhere. So when you then have a new curriculum that doesn't specify any of this stuff, the experienced teachers are okay because they can kind of eyeball something and say, yeah, well, you should roughly be about this level. But new teachers don't have that. They haven't anywhere to find that. And just to, add another anecdote to the anecdote, I had a conversation with a teacher educator in Wales, um, who's one of her, and this is in maths, and one of her students asked her, well, how are you supposed to know what to teach? Based on these, fairly high level, within that, what is it that we are teaching? And she said, well, sometimes I just tell them to go and have a look at the English syllabus for maths because that sets out in sequence what they should know. I mean, can you imagine what Welsh government would think of that? It's Welsh teachers should not be looking to the English curriculum because the Welsh curriculum itself should be answering those questions. What is it that we want children to know in maths? Um, but at the moment, it's not specific enough to provide that.
No, and it's a missed trick with an extended foundation stage because it basically covers what the best part of 4 years. So if you go nursery, reception 1 and 2,
Mm.
you've got if you can be really specific about the mathematical experiences you want kids to have in that time, then they can really fly when it comes to the more formal primary
Mhm.
element
Mhm.
of it. But if you're not being specific, well, then you're almost just replicating, I don't know, what might happen even if there were no school in the first place. I think.
Yeah, or actually, interestingly, sometimes the opposite problem happens in Northern Ireland, which was reported to me, and I saw a couple of times as well, where because it's so vague as to what you should be doing in that phase, um, teachers go in quite formal quite quickly, and in their first term, they're all sat down and they're doing some fairly formal learning, which for some children, they haven't got the prerequisite skills or understanding to access that yet. So it can go either way, but whatever it should. I'm not suggesting that anything should be based on, right, well, for this age child or at this particular stage they must be doing this thing. But what you can do that's a kind of happy medium is to specify what's the sequence of experiences that they should, and if they've got to this point, well, this is the next step, and to move through that rather than leaving it completely open.
It sounds eminently sensible when you put it like that, doesn't it? So
Hmm.
let's hope that's the direction that everyone's going to travel. I've done a really bad job this summer of not setting up England as the perfect education system. Because I was talking to some, the girls from Impact Wales,
Hmm.
and we were talking about the sort of the changes that are coming up and sort of the role of cognitive science in teaching things. And I had to apologize halfway through for going, I don't mean to set this up as England good, Wales but not good, but I clearly need to work on that because I don't know, is it Stockholm syndrome or institutionalization?
Oh, there's definitely room for improvement in England. There's certainly not.
Yeah,
I don't think that England's got everything right. It's really nice, to be honest, to be like I've been in this field for for some time now, and I started teaching in 2009. Um, and it's quite nice to have some positive things to say about England, because back then there was not much
No.
there's not much that I was I was able to say that was going well. So there's certainly much room for improvement, I think. But I do think, yeah, some of the stuff that has happened, like some of the curriculum thinking going on in individual schools in England, is absolutely fantastic.
I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating chatting with you about this, Lucy. And like I said, I'll keep my fingers crossed and I'll keep watching to see the changes unfold. And look forward to seeing you at Tadabe Cymru in Cardiff on
Yes,
the
I'm looking forward to
27th.
it.
What are you going to be speaking about?
I will be speaking about different, unsurprisingly, curriculum, different national curriculum frameworks in different countries, what's been effective in those different countries and what hasn't worked, and what schools in Wales can learn within the framework of curriculum for Wales to make that work as well as they can.
Fantastic. I'm sure lots of people are really looking forward to that. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.